many people in many countries believe that folklore means folk dances. It doesn't. Folklore covers a lot of subjects, such as traditional ways of fishing, traditional medicine, folk medicine, traditional cooking, and traditional hunting, traditional painting, traditional music or instruments, or as well as traditional dances of the people that have been inherited from one generation to the next over thousands of years. Naturally, they have evolved. All these subjects have evolved, but I'm only a specialist on folk dances, on no other side of folklore. So I shall start speaking about folk dances, their origin and meaning, which is this. Early men knew that if he didn't have enough food, he and his family or group or tribe would naturally perish. So his first and foremost aim was to get enough food, and in order to do that, since he believed that every plant, animal, seed, and insects, as well as people, had a soul, therefore he thought if he could influence the souls of these origins of his food, and through sympathetic magic, that he would never fail to have enough food to feed the family. Hence he started, for example, when the hunter-gatherers danced dances relating to the animals that he was hunting, and he danced dances round trees that gave nuts or fruit that fed him, and the fishermen danced dances relating to fish, such as using his hands like that as fins, and dancing fish, what he thought was fish, struggling in a net to show that there were plenty of fish and he had a good catch. Then they did this before they started on their fishing expeditions. And later, when agriculturalists started, they evolved rights to promote the growth of their crops. For instance, what did the crops need? They needed rain and they needed sun. So early men created dances with steps and figures that would bring luck, what he called luck, or good crops. So circle dances were created because a circle represented not only the sun, but it symbolized the moon as well, the full moon. The moon having been man's first clock. And so he started also, as he danced, all his aims, his wishes, and his thanksgiving through dance, like all the other animals who dance, and bees and insects dance, and snakes dance, and birds. They all dance, usually at the mating season. And so early men danced all his wishes. And it was the wise men of the tribe who contrived all these dances and thought of the steps and the figures, because they were, being the wise men, what we now call the priests, and they formed teams of dancers. And the agriculturalists, for example, leapt very high to show the crops how high they had to grow. For example, the Corybantes of the Near East, they danced. The Kuretis of mainland Greece, and also in Crete, they danced their agricultural dances as well. And later the Roman Salii, or Salian priests as we call them, they danced what they called 4 full jars, because all the food was kept in earthenware jars, such as Ali Baba had in his tale, in the story of Ali Baba. Huge things, and all the food was stored there. and the oil, and later on the wine, because men knew how to make wine 2,000 years before Christ, so our authorities say. And so men danced also for rain. And what did he do? Early men knew that lightning was the forerunner of storms, and storm would bring rain and water for his crops. So he danced what belly people now call the entrechat, leaping in the air and crisscrossing the feet before coming down. That represented lightning, and has nothing to do with cats, so I don't know why belly people call them entrechat. However, that's up to them. That's one of the dances, one of the steps that was used for promoting rain. And another way that the Basques have of showing the crops how high they had to grow was to kick very high. They kick above the heads, their heads, and they show the crops try and reach as high as my foot. Nowadays, of course, people have forgotten mostly. They have forgotten the origin of their steps and figures, but nevertheless, books tell us and authorities tell us all these things, and I found them very interesting. And it was Violet Alford in 1933 who first started me off on the origin and the meaning of folk dance, folk steps and figures, because before that I just danced like many other people for the joy of dancing. But I've been reading and studying ever since then, and lived with peasants in Spain and Portugal and in the southern part of France, and learned a lot from them about their way of thinking, which was very helpful. And so now I shall try and describe some of the origin of the figures. For example, in folk dances there are not only the circle going to the left, which is sunwise, which is good luck, but if you go the opposite way, anti-clockwise, then it represents the moon. And there are figures like this, the lozenge. Dancers, partners dance this lozenge, and the lozenge was a feminine symbol of birth. And it's not only in Mesopotamia, where these figures were first started, where agriculture is reputed to have first started, but all over the world, even among tribes which we call primitives, they have the same lozenge. And the lozenge is seen everywhere, on textiles, architecture, even in ironwork, and in pavements along here, where those metal covers that cover the gas and the water pipes in front of our houses. If you look at the decoration, you'll see these lozenges. And if in many of the textiles, if you see a little design in the center of the lozenge, it means and meant new life, the new birth. Now, another interesting figure is the half moon, what they call in Spanish media luna, half moon. Partners are opposite each other, and they cross over to opposite place in a half circle, and that represented the half moon and the crescent, because the moon, having been the deity of night and the promoter of rain and water, the moon being the ruler of tides and all feminine creatures, was a very important source of rain and fertility for early men. So what he did was to dance these half moons or crescent moons, and in Spain and every part of the Iberian Peninsula, except in the southeast, in Catalonia and in Andalusia, dancers must hold their arms like that in a crescent moon shape, because they represented not only the crescent moon, but the horns of the sacred bull god. Why was the bull god such a favorite all over Asia and Europe and in Africa and parts of North America? Because when man has always worshipped the source of his food, and when he domesticated cattle, well, the bull, being the progenitor of the herd, was the most important part of the herd, because without him there wouldn't have been a herd, and man venerated him, made him a deity. And just as when the Egyptians, for example, they had sheep, and they worshipped the ram. The ram was a ram god, and they made statues of the rams, magnificent statues. You can see examples of them in the British Museum. And the ram, having spiral horns like that on columns, you still see even nowadays the spirals of the capitals of these columns, which are supposed to have come from Phrygia, and that represented a fertility symbol of the ram. The spiral is not only represented by the horns of the ram, but also the snail. Man ate what he could find, and snails were eaten on the continent, as they are still. And snails always are in a spiral, have a spiral, and they're supposed to, according to people in the south of France, in Provence, it's always directed towards a certain magnetic pole. I don't know enough about it, but I've just read an article by Marcel Mougre, who insists that that is so, but that has been scientifically proved. But anyway, the spiral was seen and is seen on the snails, and therefore that became a sacred figure, because man danced his spirals asking for food, not only for rams but for snails. And another sacred figure was the triangle. Why a triangle? Because early man noticed that every new life had to have a father and a mother, and then the child, the male and the female, together, and only together created new life. Therefore, a triangle represented new life. But early man didn't need only one child, he needed a male child and a female child to to continue the tribe. So a square figure was created, and many dances contain the square. And what else about the square? Oh yes, the cross is a very ancient figure representing the sun. Why? Because early man noticed that the sun rose in the east, therefore it was called the land of birth, and its opposite was where the sun set, therefore it was called the land of death. The zenith was what we call the south, where the full warmth of the sun came from, and its opposite, the opposite of a lot of sun, meant no sun, the north, in the northern hemisphere. That's how it worked. So birth and death were joined because they were natural opposites. The zenith and the absence also of sun was joined, and that made the figure of the cross. And the figure of the cross is represented in some caves painted by early men. So it is a symbol which is very much older than Christianity, although naturally most of us don't know that, because people are not specialized in reading about the origins. They haven't got time to read about the origin of every symbol. But anyway, this cross can be danced, or is danced, in folk dances, in traditional dances, by people dividing themselves into couples, 4 people dancing in a square, and they join right hands in the middle, and then they dance clockwise, then they turn around, hold left hands and dance anti-clockwise, which is a figure which happens very often in folk dances. And that's one way of making the cross. Another way is, for instance, Morris dances or ritual dances. We call them Morris, but only here are they called Morris, but the ritual dances by 6 or 8 teams of 6 or 8 dancers is well known all over Europe, and these will dance diagonally to each other and cross over, and the others diagonally, the other 2 also making a cross. And so there are various ways of making a cross or dancing a cross. Now another figure is the ellipse. When partners face each other, instead of crossing in a straight line, they have to cross in a faint curve and then back on their own steps and back to their own positions, and that is an ellipse. Now, an ellipse is also a feminine symbol of birth, and in the 13th century, for example, they sculpted some figures of what they called Christus Pancrator, and there are churches in France that I've seen in which Christ is seated in a lozenge, in an ellipse like that, showing that he had a second birth and went back to heaven. So this ellipse figure still extant in folk dances. And now, what are the figures? Now, if we look back to ancient men and the first agriculturalists, we shall see that among the rites that he created in order to ensure good crops, he had deities. He built deities, presumably of osier, and because they were deities and more powerful than humans, they were built as much larger humans than a normal human being, and these deities were carried from field to field so that they would bless the crops, and at the same time the various deities would meet and be friends. Now, it appears to be that when Neolithic men brought the knowledge of agriculture and culture of grain to Europe, looking for new pastures, he also brought the rites and the deities that accompanied the growth and the cultivation. And these giants that we meet with in Spain, in Portugal, and in Belgium were brought over must have been brought over by these Neolithic peoples. For example, these giants always go in pairs because early men knew that there had to be, for new life, there had to be a male and a female. So there's a king and queen, and nowadays the king and queen who are white, the good ones, and they had to have their opposites, the king and queen who were black, the bad ones. But because the Balkans were under Turkish domination for 350 years, some of the beliefs of the Near East were incorporated in the Balkans, and therefore in habits and rites that were propagated all over Europe. And so you see these huge figures, which we shall look at some in a moment, which are carried about for all festivals in Spain and in Portugal. And now, since man has forgotten the origin of these gigantic figures, in order to please the whole world, he has, in Spain anyway, he's brought a red king and queen, meaning representing the Red Indians of North America, and a yellow king and queen representing the Chinese and the Japanese people. So now they have 8 giants in Spain. They process them, and there's one man that carries each figure. They're tremendously tall, up to 18 feet high, and in front of them they go in procession. There are little people called the dwarfs. They're really men who have a huge papier-mâché head like that, and because of the head they appear to be dwarfs, but they aren't. They're normal men and women. Now these dwarfs represented the spirits of the underworld, because early men believed that the underworld was full of spirits or souls, this world was full of spirits or souls, and the heavens were also full of spirits. So in order to communicate with every one of the 3 types, the underworld, this world, and the heavens, these fairies or little people or souls communicated, or spirits communicated with one another. And in order to promote the crops, men stamped like that very hard on the ground in order to wake the spirits of the earth and remind them, come on, do your duty and make the crops grow and the pastures grow. It's your duty to do that. Nowadays in England we call them fairies, but they were originated as spirits of the underworld. So in Spain we see now 4, 6 or 8, sometimes up to 16 dwarfs walking in procession in front of the 8 giants. Now these dwarfs have to be 6, which is a number of the sun, or 8, which is a number of the sun, or doubled 16. Because why are 8 and 6 numbers of the sun? Because there was the father, the mother, and the child, the renewal of the year. The sun was in charge of the renewal of the year, and in order to ensure that the year should come back again, there would be spring and regeneration of nature. So men danced 6 men together. That means double 3 to make quite sure that there was good luck and that there would be sun, or else 8. That meant 4, father, mother, son, and daughter, or the equivalent, the representatives of these 4, doubled to make quite sure that there would be sun or good luck. Or in other words, the cross, the 4 sides of the cross doubled, because man was so eager to ensure enough food. Another figure which these ritual dancers always do, and you see them even in the Far East doing, is a figure of 8. Now, why the figure of 8? Well, early men noticed that the year had a cycle, the 4 seasons, and after sleeping in winter, the new year, spring, would come back, and therefore it made a circle as well as a cycle. And in order to ensure that the cycle would come back, so he made the double cycle, which was a figure of 8, what we call the figure of 8, and so there was no beginning and no end to this, to the year, or to life. And not only did early men believe that, but you will see this figure of 8 in Muslim and many religions, and also the early Celtic designs. You can follow the design, and then in the end it comes back to the original, which is development from the circle, what the Greeks used to call the Ouroboros, which was a snake biting its own tail. As soon as it came to the end, to the tail end, you started again with the head. The same with the cycle of the year. And so it's very interesting to see how men continued the dances and continued the traditions. Now, only the ritual dancers, the men ritual dancers, which we call Morris in England, danced in 6 or 8, and very often you see the 8 dividing into 2 sets of 4s, and then they do sunwise figures, and then they mix up again and dance other figures. But what was the moon? The number of the moon? 5 was the number of the moon. Why? Because in the north of the Iberian Peninsula, the moon was worshipped with matriarchy, because matriarchy was tied up or connected with the moon. And there had to be matriarchy in those days, because in the early days, when man was a hunter-gatherer, because one woman looked after the home and the children, and she had to have several husbands to go and hunt the wild animals, because one man alone couldn't manage. And so in the north of the Iberian Peninsula, oranges don't grow, it's too cold, but the apple was the emblem of matriarchy and the moon, because if you cut an apple across, it has 5 divisions, and as the apple was the emblem of matriarchy, and the number of the divisions in the apple was 5, therefore the moon, emblem of matriarchy, had its number as number 5, whereas the orange has many divisions, and that was, as we explained, 6 was the number of the sun. And patriarchy started with men herding animals, having cattle, because the man was more important. One man alone could look after many animals, and so patriarchy started. And patriarchy was taken over to the southern Mediterranean. One thing I forgot to say was about the giants, to go back to the giants. When Charles V made himself king of Spain, he also was king further north, in the north of France and in Belgium, what was then Flanders. And so he had many soldiers from Flanders come to the south of Spain, and vice versa. And these soldiers, the Spanish ones, took over the habits and many of the customs from the south, the southern Mediterranean, into Flanders, and that's where the Belgians got their giants, according to my way of thinking. They were not invented by the Belgians, as the Belgians tell you nowadays. Belgium is such a small country. Why should such an invention, which is extraordinary, like giants, which were copied from the Spanish ones, why should they be invented in that tiny little part of northern Europe, like Belgium, where the rest of Europe didn't invent them? There's no accounting for this, especially as they look like the Spanish ones. Now, the name Morris, to go back to the name Morris, some people say, they were dances danced by the Moors. Not at all. Apparently, in Essex and in parts of the north of England, where the men had factories of cloth, all the bits of cloth which were no use and thrown away were called mollies, and men rolled up these bits of cloth, especially red ones, and used them instead of the sticks in Morris dances, and these were called dances of mollies. In parts of Lancashire they still dance with these mollies, and these mollies represented the phallus, symbol of fertility, and they have exactly the same in Sitges, which is a town on the Mediterranean coast south of Barcelona, and they have these mollies also read exactly the same as in Lancashire, and that is where, so Morris dancers have told me, the origin of the name Morris came from mollies, and not from the word Moor. When the Moors were sent away expelled from Spain by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Aragon, then it became the fashion to be and to have everything Moorish, imitation Moorish. And there are some stately homes in Britain where there are large portraits like this of the owners and the squires and the ladies dressed in Moorish Turkish costumes, wearing wide silk trousers and turbans. But now I would like to go back to sticks. Why do Morris men carry sticks? Early agriculturalists did not have ploughs, but they had to make a hole in the earth, so they used a stick and made a hole, dropped a few seeds, then covered them over with their foot, took another step and repeated the process. And for them the stick was the phallus, making a hole and putting seed in Mother Earth, because the earth was the source of all vegetation. Therefore it had to be feminine, since only feminine creatures brought forth new life. And so the earth was made an earth goddess, or a Mother Earth. And in order to wake the spirits of the earth, not only did men stamp occasionally on the ground in their dances, but they also struck sticks, because the voice of the sticks would help to wake the spirits of the earth. Later, when metal was discovered and swords were made and they struck, they were stronger, more powerful than wood, because they could cut the wood and their sound was louder, and therefore swords were adopted in the Morris dances. But places where metal was made and found, and swords and all sorts of metal implements were made, were few and far between. Those people who didn't live near a mine continued to use sticks. Therefore we still have the mixture of sticks and swords in folk dances, in Morris dances, in ritual dances. And right across Europe, even into India, I've seen people from the islands and men dancing the ritual dances with figures similar to those performed by European ritual dancers, and they also used either sticks or swords. So that's it for the moment. Now we shall have a look at some photos. This is a picture of some of the dwarfs in the north of Spain. Now this is another picture. You'll see a dwarf in the front, and then two giants. The female is behind the dwarf and the male is on the right, from the same place in the north of Spain. Here we have from Tarragona, right near on the Mediterranean coast, a queen. She's a Christian queen, and they're processing at night or just at dusk, and they go on processing. It takes quite a long time for them to go around the town, so it grew dusk. One can see the height of the humans level with the hand of the queen, white Christian queen, meaning good. Another aspect of Moors and Christians is the Old Year, the fight between the Old Year and the New Year. The Old Year was bad and the New Year was good. In some parts of the Iberian Peninsula, such as in Navarre, in Ochagavia, they have the usual ritual dance like the Morris, and the leader or the jester wears a mask, front and back. In the front he has a wicked old face, the face of a wicked old man, and at the back the face of a very good and pure young man. That's the Old Year being sent away and vanquished by the New Year who comes after the Old Year. There are many ways of sending the Old Year out, and one is to whip the ground or whip the air, as some of the Swiss do, and what we call whifflers with long whips, and they send away all the evil spirits. And as in Rome and Greece, what they used to do was to take a goat, for example, and take it round the village or town, and everybody hit it, wishing the evil spirits to go into the goat. And when the goat was full of all the evil spirits, such as diseases and disasters and famine and all that type of evils that can happen to man, the goat was taken to a high place and thrown over a precipice, so that the Old Year was purified, and the young, new, innocent New Year was allowed to come in. And the Christians and Moors' beliefs were mixed up with this, and in a place called Villena, which is about 100 kilometers north of Alicante, just south of the Meseta, the central Meseta of Spain, Villena has a yearly wonderful festival of Christians and Moors, and they have there a large wooden castle which they erect every year, and in it the princess, until a few years ago the Moorish princess was still in it. Now they've stopped having the Moorish princess, but up till a few years ago there was the Moors protected the castle and the princess, and the Christian hordes came and finally vanquished the Moors and took the princess away, which meant that spring was able to come. It was another way of interpreting Persephone going down to Hades for the winter and then being brought up by the god Apollo, without whose help there would be no rejuvenation of nature. And it was another way of interpreting this Moors and Christians in Villena. They have forgotten the origin of it now, but what they do is to process in groups all day, and there are, each group of either Christians or Moors is led by a captain, and behind them comes a band, and people prefer to be in the Moorish contingents because their costumes are so much richer and colorful than the Christians. The Christians have, for some reason that I don't know, they have pirates as a contingent of Christians, and another one is the students, who are always so hungry that they carry a huge wooden spoon on their shoulders and march through. They don't dance anymore, they just march through and process through the town, and it takes several hours to do that. And then what they used to do was to fight for the princess and release her, and so bring forth spring once more. But in Villena, they make a tremendous show of it, and the girls don't like to be left out, so they dress in magnificent costumes, the regional costumes, and in the evenings they go out in coaches, horse-drawn coaches, and open, no top to it, no top to the coaches, so that people can admire them. And the horses are decorated with an enormous amount of draperies of tassels as long as this, so that it nearly touches the ground. It must be very heavy for the poor horses to carry that and draw a coach as well, but they go on until quite late at night, and then about 11 at night the soldiers come out, or people who pretend to be soldiers, men who pretend to be soldiers, with their guns, and they shoot up in the air against the evil spirits. It's another way of sending the evil spirits away and purifying the air. And it's so deafening that people, dogs and children flee from the main road where they shoot with these guns. And I ran away as well, because I couldn't stand the noise, the din. I'm sure all the evil spirits, including myself, were sent away, and the air was purified. So there we are. Thank you. I should like now to mention dances of Spain. Most people think of flamenco and stage flamenco arrangements when Spanish dances are mentioned. Only a small part, less than a fifth of Spain, which is Andalusia, is where flamenco dancing is. It was the part which was conquered by the Moors in 711, and they liked that part of Spain so much that they stayed there for 700 years. But the artistic interpretations and manifestations of the Moors were amalgamated with those that were already extant along the southern part of Spain and Portugal, because traders had come from all parts of eastern Mediterranean, and including Egyptians and Palestinians and Assyrians and Massilians and Cretans or Minoans, and also from North Africa, and they had amalgamated their dances in such a way that they were very interesting and outstanding, even in the time of Pliny the Elder, who mentions it. That he says that in Rome, when there was a famine, all foreigners were expelled from Rome, except 2,000 people from Tarshish or from Andalusia, because they were such musicians and dancers that the Roman aristocracy couldn't do without, so they said. Well, anyway, when the Moors came, they brought in their way of dancing, and their way of dancing was learnt, a lot of it was learnt from the Persians when the Arabs had conquered Persia. And both the Persian and the Arabic people had learnt from each other, learnt a lot from each other. And when the Arabs went back to Arabia only and Persia was freed, and the Arabs went along the northern coast of Africa and settled in Morocco, and then they went into Spain, as I said, in 711, their dances contained a lot of Persian movements, including these, which are movements imitating the snakes, because in Persia, like in most of Asia and in many parts of Europe and many parts of Africa, the snake was and is worshipped. They were an emblem of water, an emblem of virility, the earth spirit, and people in Morocco still worship them. There are men who pipe tunes, and they're snake charmers, or so-called snake charmers. Well, as the women used to look after the snakes, they kept them alive, and just as the Greeks used to also, the Oracle of Delphi was a snake they called a python, looked after by a virgin called a pythoness, and she interpreted the motions of the snake and made them into oracles. But to go back to the Moors, when they danced, their ways of dancing mixed in Andalusia, and then the people amalgamated the old forms of dances with the modern, or for them at the time, the Moorish type of dancing, and flamenco evolved from there, including the footwork. Now, the footwork was, as we've mentioned before, to wake the spirits of the earth and make them do their duty by bringing the crops and the pastures, making them grow. But it has nothing to do with the rest of Spain. The rest of Spain have dances all their own. Each province has its own style because of the ethnic influences and the invasions from different tribes that settled in various provinces of Spain. And so it's very interesting to see how varied the dances are. And in Catalonia, which is the eastern Mediterranean part of Spain, there they have their arms only shoulder level. The hands must be like that to represent doves, because there's a lot of Greek influence, and the dove was the bird of Aphrodite, of love, and so only in Catalonia do they use this type of arm movements. They do not use the crescent moon, neither do they use the Andalusian snake type of movement. So it's interesting for a folk dancer to visit different parts of Spain to see how varied the dances can be. And the steps and the figures have all what do you call it? They have a common origin. That's right. They have a common origin, as we mentioned. But the fiorituri, the arm movements, and the music, of course, was different. Of course, the costume influences the style of dancing, because naturally, if you have a very wide, long dress, you can't dance with the same quick foot flicks that you can do when you wear a short dress, as in Aragon. But also, if it's hot weather, you can't dance for half an hour or several hours running, as they do in most parts of the Iberian Peninsula. You can't dance when it's very hot, because you have to walk through your steps, whereas in mountain places or colder regions you can hop, and you can tell by the style of the dance what kind of climate the originators came from. So that's it. One can go on for hours mentioning all these things, but it's interesting to see them oneself. Thank you. There's a curious phenomenon about flamenco. People believe, including most Spaniards, that flamenco was brought over by gypsies. That's not true. The gypsies came into Spain in the late 15th century, early 16th century, when the dancers of Andalusia were already very well known, as we mentioned, and the gypsies were said to have, according to various authorities, to have come from India, from the Indus Valley, after an invasion by an unknown tribe, and those who were able to save themselves went across the Middle East into Egypt, and some went into other members of the tribe went into Europe, and gradually they went all over Europe and Great Britain as well, including in Spain. But as they were nomads, they had difficulty in making a living, so the men, being tinsmiths, also bred horses and stole, and the women made baskets, told fortunes, and sewed bunches of flowers they gathered in the fields, and then they also started stealing. But they noticed that in Andalusia there were Spaniards who danced in the taverns and made money that way, and so some of the men thought that they would learn the guitar, and they learned to play the guitar in a Spanish fashion, and some of the women imitated the Spanish women, the Andalusian women dancing, and then they had the same movements as the Andalusian women, so-called flamenco. The so-called flamenco, and they imitated the Spaniards and danced to show themselves off and earn some money. But the Spaniards considered that ladies of loose living were either French or gypsy, so they called a gypsy dancer mexicana, and as the gitanas were the ones who danced in taverns and therefore were considered loose, because a respectable Spanish woman wouldn't dance in a tavern. Therefore, the dance was called, flamenco dancing was called gypsy dancing, and the Spaniards are chiefly to blame for that. But to go back to the origin of the word flamenco, it is said by Spanish folklorists that when Charles V of Spain went into back to Belgium and brought some Flemish soldiers with him, the soldiers naturally had to have recreation in the evenings. They went to these taverns and they liked the dancing, and so they would, the Spaniards then would say, that's the style of dancing that the Flemish people like, so they call it el estilo flamenco, the style which the Flemish men like. And that is where the origin of the word flamenco is said to have originated. It was not a autochthonous Spanish or Andalusian name. But to go back to the gypsies, those who settled in Hungary adopted the Hungarian style of music and dance, and those who settled in different parts of Europe adopted the customs or the music and the dance ways of their host country. But nowhere in the rest of Europe or in the British Isles do any of the gypsies know anything whatsoever about flamenco dancing. Had the gypsies brought it with them, that particular Andalusian style of dancing, then they would have something left. They have nothing whatsoever to do with the movements of flamenco dancing. And even in the rest of Spain, they don't. Only those who have learnt or copied Spaniards from Andalusia know something about the dancing, but they don't have dance sequences like the Spaniards, because they could never afford to have lessons. They just imitated the movements, and some of them imitate them well. But still, it is a fable to say that flamenco is gypsy dancing. It isn't. If it were, then, as I said, gypsies from the whole of Europe would know something about flamenco, and they don't know anything about it whatsoever. So that's it. I hope the gypsy fable will explode one day. When we went to Spain, my husband and I, in 1926, and stayed there till the Civil War in 1936, and we had the first English school in Spain, there were hardly any gypsy women who danced in the taverns, either in Barcelona or other cities, even in Andalusia. But gradually, as foreigners went and spent more holidays, or their holidays, in Andalusia and along the coast, then gypsy women went in the taverns and they earned some money that way. In the north and central parts of Spain, nowadays there are gypsy women in taverns in the big cities because they find that they can make money there as well. But when we lived there, those 10 years, definitely no gypsy women danced in the taverns. So flamenco is definitely not gypsy, and the gypsies definitely did not bring flamenco into Spain. So those who think otherwise are quite mistaken. It's just a fable.